So here are a list of defense mechanisms that we're going to be talking about today. Repression, denial, projection, rationalization, intellectualization, reaction formation, regression, identification, displacement, and sublimation. I'm going to pause now for a bit. Okay, so let's start talking about some defense mechanisms. Repression, that is the most important defense mechanism. That is the one the classic one. That's the one that really is a crucial aspect of Freud's theory. The idea that you are taking something from the consciousness and forcing it into your unconscious. It is so in other words, we are the memories and pain and anxiety, pushing it out of our consciousness into our unconscious. Now, we'll often try to suppress our thoughts. That's suppression. That's different. That's where you're consciously trying not to think about something. But trying not to think about something has been shown to not be a very good idea. It doesn't really work. So, for example, try not to think of a purple turtle. Now, I'm sure many of you had images of purple turtles coming to your mind when you're told not to think about it. And again, there have been a number of research studies showing how difficult it is to suppress thoughts. And when you try to suppress it, it keeps coming back and coming back and coming back. But basically, the idea is you have these impulses. If they get out of control, you might act on them in an inappropriate way. So repression allows us to restrain those impulses. Also, again, these upsetting memories, people talk about, you've heard about cases of adults who had repressed memories of child abuse or child sexual abuse. So like talking about an adult saying they didn't remember it ever happening, but now the memory is coming back to them. The idea is that it's repression, that the memory was repressed. You can have repression, where it's not complete, partial repression. Maybe only repressing certain aspects of your experience, but consciously remembering others. So repression is an important, probably the most important defense mechanism. Push it out of our consciousness into our unconscious. Denial, of course, I think we've heard about this before. Basically, what denial is not the same thing as repression. Denial is you're taking a real condition, a real life event, and you are refusing to believe that it exists. See, with repression, it could just be a simple thought. That isn't necessarily a real life thing that you can repress. But when we're talking about a real life situation, like being alcoholic or having a spouse that died, all of these real life events, if you deny that they exist, you're going to have a lot of problems. But nevertheless, being aware of those things, thinking about it, it makes you upset, so denial is a way to protect ourselves. But it takes a lot to try to pretend that a real situation doesn't exist. So repression and denial take a lot of energy, denial especially, to keep pushing that stuff. And again, imagine thinking about like a pot of boiling water. If you keep covering up that pot, covering it up, and turning up the heat, the lid's going to pop off. Pot is going to explode. So repression essentially pushes everything down. Denial, again, you are refusing to believe a real life situation exists, and that it can get you into a lot of trouble. Projection is a way of releasing this id energy and doing it in a way that protects yourself from anxiety. Okay? And the way it works here is, if you have these impulses yourself that may be morally unacceptable, Of course, we all have those impulses, but maybe these unconscious impulses coming from the id that really make us feel guilty, maybe make us feel shame. Well, we can keep this all repressed, or we can release it in a way that will keep ourselves out of trouble, so to speak. So, you take this unacceptable impulse and you just basically put it on someone else. You accuse someone else of having the same kind of impulse that you have. Okay? So, you're releasing the energy, makes you feel better, but you're not recognizing that this impulse is coming from yourself. It's sort of like someone who has urges to cheat on his or her partner and doesn't want to come to terms with those urges, so instead, might slap their partner for looking at somebody else, or accuse them of looking at somebody else, saying you always want to cheat on me, you always want to have an affair, when in reality it's you who have this unconscious impulse, but you are essentially keeping it out of your awareness. Here's one that's popular among intelligent college students like yourselves, is that you find a good, plausible reason for your behavior, but the real reason is unacceptable. So the reason that you come up with sounds good, but it's really baloney. Your reason is unacceptable. Maybe, in other words, so for example, let's say you fail an exam. You can rationalize that maybe the exam was unfair, and that maybe there were all these other circumstances that were out of your control that interfered with your ability to do well, when in reality maybe you just didn't study and you were too lazy or whatever, or maybe you're not that smart. That would be these are unpleasant thoughts to have about yourself, and you rationalize to kind of relieve yourself of those kind of unpleasant thoughts. Reaction formation is another form of defense mechanism, and this one is where you have this unconscious impulse, and like with projection, you take that unconscious impulse and basically you put it on someone else, accuse someone else of having that impulse, absolving yourself. But a similar one is reaction formation. In this case, you take this impulse that you have and you now express the opposite impulse. The opposite being, and in the opposite and often in an exaggerated way. So the idea of going overboard on something, being overly enthusiastic, the idea of killing someone with kindness, maybe an example of reaction formation. When you kill someone with kindness, maybe that there's an underlying actual hostility toward that person that you're expressing with being overly affectionate, perhaps, and overly kind. And again, that would be, so like an example might be sexual promiscuity. If you're having, is going the opposite of what you might be feeling. Homophobia is often used as an example of homophobia. For someone who has attraction towards same-sex partners, they might engage in reaction formation by being virulently anti-gay, and in such a way that it becomes overly ridiculous. And that would be an example of reaction formation, kind of going overboard in the opposite direction. Intellectualization, again, something useful for intelligent college students. Being able to kind of push out the emotion. You're thinking about it, about something that really is an emotionally, has a strong emotional component to it. But now you're kind of thinking of it without any emotion, in a cold, analytical, detached way. For example, let's say you've just been diagnosed with breast cancer. Very, very scary emotional experience, but instead of getting emotional about it, instead of really expressing your fear and your terror and your sadness, you can more or less just talk about the disease and talk about the research you're doing on it and all this information when you're not really getting emotional about it. That's intellectualization. The suggestion is that you're taking the emotional aspect of it and repressing it and just dealing with the intellectual aspect of it. Regression is an interesting one. This is where you will revert back to an earlier stage of development, essentially responding to anxiety, responding to this trouble by essentially behaving more like a child. Now, when we get to the psychosexual stages, we'll talk about the different fixations that occur at each of these stages, these erogenous zones that we're going to talk about. So, like during the oral stage, the source of pleasure is the mouth. Well, maybe as an adult, you might suck your thumb when you're trying to cope with something that's very, very painful. Instead of dealing with it in a mature way, you're going to go back into regression. Identification is a natural part, according to Freud, of growing up, where the child identifies with the same-sex parent, and it's a way of dealing with the underlying hostility that you might have toward the same-sex parent as perhaps a rival. So in other words, and we'll talk about that when we get to the Oedipus complex. So they repress them and identify with the parent, with the same-sex parent, try to identify with them, try to become like them, imitate them, and that, according to Freud, is a process where you're coping with that Oedipus complex. Displacement is another defense mechanism, and this is where you're taking this energy, this id energy, this id, maybe it's a feeling of hostility or something toward a particular person, let's say, and instead of actually going after that person, now you would try to seek a new target, one that is less threatening, so your anxiety is reduced. So, for example, it might be maybe you're really, really angry at your boss. Your boss insults you at work in front of everybody, and you're really, really angry. But to be very hostile and aggressive toward your boss could get you in trouble or perhaps even arrested. So maybe when you come home, you kind of take it out on your kid, or you take it out on your significant other, kind of yell at them for something a little bit more than you would normally. Because this new target is less threatening, you can do it. Now, oftentimes, in psychoanalysis, which is essentially Freud's theory applied to therapy, is that the therapist will try to get the client to displace his or her feelings onto the therapist, who the therapist is being a safe target of all of those thoughts and feelings. Finally, sublimation, and this is considered to be the most mature of the defense mechanisms and helps you more adapt to the real world. So you have this impulse that may be unpleasant, it may be immoral, it may be hostile, whatever it is, and you transform it into something that is more socially acceptable. So the impulse, the original impulse coming from the id, is one that may be disturbing, but maybe you can transform that impulse into something more acceptable. Like, for example, you have this hostile feeling, you wanted to, maybe this coming from your thanatos, right? To be self-destructive. Instead of being self-destructive, maybe you go into sports and you put all your energy into that, or you exercise, or you even do something creative like paint. All of that is taking this energy that's coming from inside and expressing it in a safe, respectable way. Okay, I'm going to take a pause now.